A woman who's both fat and can't even bear a single child. You could toss her out on the street, and nobody would bother to pick her up. The words were hurled across the crowded diner, sharp as a cleaver. The whole row of tables burst out laughing. The woman standing there, her hands still trembling around a stack of dirty plates, lowered her head as if trying to fold herself into something small enough to disappear. But the man seated at the table in the far corner, the one no soul in that diner dared look in the eye, simply set his coffee cup down in silence. And it was his silence, that night, that changed everything. Has anyone ever been looked at by the whole world as though they didn't exist? Mocked for their body, for things they could never change, for a pain they had buried for years? Has anyone ever had to swallow their tears and force a smile while serving the very people who had just trampled on their dignity only because they had nowhere else to go? Chicago, a late autumn night, rain lashing the streets like a whip. It was a city where power was measured in fear, a place with names people only dared to whisper. And in that cold city, fate had seated a poor, lifelong, scorned waitress across from the most ruthless man it had ever produced. What happened after that night left all of Chicago speechless, because what lay hidden inside that yellowed envelope at the bottom of an old drawer, something a trembling hand had concealed long ago, was enough to shake those who seemed beyond shaking and to overturn a fate everyone believed was already sealed. Stay until the end, to understand why that rainy night changed forever the lives of two people wounded to their very core. Love, pain, the will to rise again, and an ending that will bring tears to your eyes. All of it is only just beginning. If this story touches your heart, leave a like and share it to bring it to even more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because stories that move the soul like this one are still waiting for you ahead. Donovan Vale never had to raise his voice to make people obey. That was the first thing anyone learned when they stepped into his world. And it was also the last thing many men managed to understand before they disappeared from Chicago. His name was spoken in locked rooms more like a warning than like the name of a man. People said he owned half the city's underworld, but what made him frightening wasn't what he possessed. It was the way he looked at a liar, silent and patient, until the liar collapsed beneath that gaze all on his own. That night, before the rain came pouring down over the diner where fate was waiting, Donovan was standing inside an old warehouse on the south side of the city, one hand tucked into the pocket of his dark coat, listening to a man named Royce explain the missing money. Royce was one of his men, a debt collector known for having a heavy hand, and tonight he was sweating even though the air was bitterly cold. Beside him, a thin, middle-aged man knelt on the concrete floor, his lips split, both hands clutching his chest. He was the owner of a small shoe repair shop who had fallen behind on a few dollars of protection money. Royce had beaten him to impress his superior, thinking cruelty was what Donovan wanted to see. He was wrong. Donovan stepped forward, each footfall ringing evenly across the floor, and the whole warehouse seemed to hold its breath with him. He bent down and looked at the shoe shop owner, then turned to Royce. When his voice rose, it wasn't loud, but it was enough to make every other sound die. He asked Royce what he thought he had proven by beating an old man who couldn't afford to pay a few dollars. Royce stammered that he had only followed the rules, that anyone who owed had to pay. Donovan looked at him for a long while, and that look was heavier than any threat. Then he said that in this city, there were countless strong men, and he didn't need one more strong man who knew how to bully someone weaker than himself. He said any man who stepped on someone who couldn't stand back up wasn't a man at all, but the lowest kind of creature he had ever encountered, and he didn't keep creatures like that in his house. Royce opened his mouth to argue, but Donovan raised one hand, only a small gesture, and the man went silent as if his throat had been squeezed shut. Donovan ordered the two men standing nearby to take Royce outside, strip him of everything he had, and let the whole city know that from that night on, Royce no longer belonged to his organization. Not another drop of blood fell, but everyone inside that warehouse understood that Royce had just lost everything, and he would never get it back. After that, Donovan turned to the shoe shop owner, who was still trembling, and helped him to his feet with a hand strangely steady for a man who had just done what he had done. He told his people to wipe away the man's entire debt, take him home properly, and make it clear that from now on, no one was allowed to touch that shoe shop again. The man looked up at him, tears filling his eyes. His mouth stumbling over words of gratitude Donovan didn't bother to hear to the end. He had already turned and walked away, because to him, protecting someone weak wasn't kindness. It was a duty he had set for himself, a private law he obeyed more strictly than any law the city had ever written. Some people guessed at the reason, whispering behind his back that a man that cold must be carrying some wound inside him that had never healed, but no one dared ask, and Donovan never told. He walked out of the warehouse, pulled up his collar as the first drops of rain began to fall, climbed into the black car waiting outside, and told the driver to take him to a small diner where he sometimes stopped for a late meal. He had no idea that in that very ordinary diner, tonight, there was a woman counting every minute until her shift ended, carrying a burden on her shoulders that no one in the whole city had ever bothered to ask about, and that fate had arranged for the two most wounded souls in Chicago to meet beneath the same rain-soaked awning. The diner Donovan was about to enter was called Kane's Corner, a modest little place on a damp street corner, and the woman wiping down the last table of the afternoon shift was Margaret Sullivan, the woman everyone simply called Maggie. Nearly 10 hours had passed since she had walked into the diner before dawn, and her legs now felt as heavy as if stones had been tied to them, but she still wasn't allowed to go home, because tonight she had taken on the night shift as well, to make up the money she was still short. Working 2 shifts a day had become ordinary for Maggie for more than a year now. Ever since her mother died and left behind a mountain of hospital bills Maggie couldn't begin to understand, because she had no idea how they could possibly be so large. Her hands, once as soft as those of any other 27-year-old woman, were now calloused and cracked from dishwater and from carrying hot stacks of plates in and out without rest. She didn't complain, had never complained, because she believed whining didn't lighten a burden. It only made people more tired. Her body was full-figured, and that body was what the world most loved to turn into a joke. Regular customers called her by mocking little names, while a few idle men made comments about her shape right in front of her, as if she had no ears to hear or no heart to hurt. Maggie had learned to let those words slide off her like water slipping over oil, at least on the outside, because she understood that if she let even one drop of pain show, people would only take it as permission to go further. But at night, when she lay alone in her cramped, rented room, she often hugged her pillow and wondered what sin she had committed for life to treat her this way. What kept her standing through it all wasn't hope, because hope had run dry long ago, but a silent kind of self-respect, a stubborn belief that no matter how cheaply people valued her, she would still work honestly, live uprightly, and never bow her head to beg anyone for anything. She treated even the most difficult customers gently, saved leftover food for the homeless people, who sometimes stood tucked along the side of the diner, and always smiled at the children who came in with their parents, even though she herself had never been allowed to become a mother. That past was the deepest wound she kept hidden, more carefully than anything else, something no one in all of Chicago knew and something she didn't intend to tell anyone. The owner of Kane's Corner was Bradford Kane, a fat man with a smile that always looked slick and pale, like grease congealing on a cold plate. And Bradford wasn't only the employer who paid Maggie's wages. He was also the man holding the debt that hung over her head. Every time he passed by, he would drop some reminder about the money she still owed, his voice sugary on the surface but filled underneath with threat, as if he were doing her a kindness by allowing her to keep working so she could pay him back. Maggie disliked him, with an instinctive dislike she couldn't explain. But she needed this job, needed every stray coin, so she swallowed everything down and kept lowering her head to wipe the tables. That evening, Bradford called her into the corner of the counter, lowered his voice, and said the next payment date was coming close, that she had better be sensible and try harder, and that a woman like her didn't have any choices left except to cling to this job. His words felt like a noose tightening slowly around her neck, and Maggie could only nod, her rough hands clenched together beneath her apron to hide their trembling. She didn't know that in just a few more minutes, when the diner door swung open to admit a guest from the night rain, everything in her life, which had seemed frozen forever, would begin to move in a direction she had never dared to dream of. The door of Kane's Corner swung open with a rush of cold wind and the hard rushing sound of rain, and the man who stepped inside wore a dark coat soaked across both shoulders, carrying with him the kind of presence that made the whole diner suddenly sink into silence for a beat. Not everyone in the diner knew Donovan Vale's face, but those who did immediately lowered their eyes to their plates, and even those who didn't know him could feel that the man who had just walked in wasn't ordinary. Around him, there was a heavy stillness that people instinctively wanted to keep away from. Bradford recognized him from behind the counter at once. The man's face went pale for a moment before he hurriedly forced out a smile, but his feet stayed fixed to the floor, and he didn't dare step forward to greet him. The other servers were the same. One pretended to be busy wiping the counter. Another slipped into the kitchen, because no one wanted to be the one who had to approach the table, where that cold guest had just sat down in the shadowed corner at the back of the diner. They were afraid one small mistake in serving him would bring disaster. Afraid one careless word would cost them a price they couldn't afford to pay. So the whole diner simply left the man sitting there as if he were invisible, while still stealing glances at him with eyes full of both curiosity and fear. Only Maggie, after she finished wiping the last table, looked up and saw that no one had served the guest. She picked up a menu and a glass of water and walked over, simply because to her, a customer was a customer, and leaving someone sitting unattended in the middle of a diner went against everything she believed in. She didn't know who he was, and even though a faint instinct warned her that this man wasn't like anyone else, she still treated him the way she treated every other human being, without fear and without flattery. She set the glass of water down in front of him, with a gentle motion, asked if the cold had soaked through him, and whether he wanted something warm. Her voice was calm and kind, as if he were only a tired man who had just come in from the rain, not the name half the city lowered its voice to speak. Donovan lifted his eyes to look at her, and in that moment, something made him pause longer than usual, because it had been far too long since he had met a pair of eyes that looked at him without even the faintest trace of fear or calculation. He ordered a cup of black coffee and something hot, and Maggie nodded, saying the kitchen was about to close, but she would ask them to make him a bowl of soup while it was still warm, because on a night like this, an empty stomach could make the cold sink all the way to the bone. When she turned away, a customer at the next table made a familiar mocking comment about her body, loud enough for the whole corner of the diner to hear, and the men sitting beside him laughed along. Maggie stopped for only half a second, then kept walking toward the kitchen with her back straight and her chin slightly raised, giving no answer, not collapsing, carrying herself with the dignified endurance of someone far too used to invisible knives, and still determined not to let them pierce through her. Donovan saw it all, from the cruel words to the way she silently swallowed them, without losing the kindness she had just shown him. And something inside his chest, something he had thought had long ago turned to stone, stirred faintly. He watched her disappear into the kitchen, then swept his gaze over the men who had just laughed, memorizing every face in silence the way he had always memorized everything. When the bowl of soup was brought out, it was Maggie again who carried it to him, and she set it down with a simple wish that he enjoy his meal, so plain and sincere that he almost forgot the last time anyone had said such a thing to him, without fear attached to it. He didn't say much, only gave a slight nod, but inside the mind of the most powerful man in Chicago, a certain attention had begun to take shape, one he himself could not yet name, an attention that only a few hours later would become the reason he did something he had never done for a stranger. The cruel sentence thrown across the diner that night should have been only one among the countless insults Maggie had learned to swallow, but this time, it didn't end there, because Bradford Kane chose that exact moment to pour all of his cowardice over her. While the laughter in the diner had not yet died away, he stepped out from behind the counter with his face flushed red, loudly blaming Maggie for breaking a stack of plates she had never even touched, then used that excuse to lash out at her in front of the entire diner. Maggie tried to explain in a soft voice that she hadn't done it, but Bradford didn't need the truth. He only needed a reason to show his power and push her one step lower in everyone's eyes. He announced that she was fired on the spot, throwing vicious words straight into her face, saying that if someone like her disappeared from the place, the diner wouldn't lose a thing, and that she ought to feel lucky she had been allowed to stay there for so long. The whole diner fell utterly silent. A few people still curled their lips, waiting to see how she would cry and beg, because to them, a poor woman fired in the middle of a rainy night would surely have to fall to her knees and plead to keep the only bread she had. But Maggie didn't do that. She stood straight, and though her lips trembled and her eyes were red with humiliation, she still lifted her chin, looked Bradford directly in the face, and said in a voice that was quiet but did not break that she had never stolen or cheated for a single day in that place, and that he could take away her job, but he couldn't take away her honesty. Then she silently untied her apron, folded it neatly, and laid it on the counter, without a word of complaint, without letting a single tear fall in front of the crowd. That dignity made a few of the people waiting for entertainment turn their faces away in unease. She walked to the door with her back straight, but the moment the door closed behind her and the icy rain struck her face, all the strength she had forced herself to hold together inside the diner suddenly vanished, like smoke. The darkness swallowed her, and the late autumn rain was so cold it seemed to cut into her skin, soaking through her thin coat after only a few steps. Maggie had walked a short distance when her legs began to sway, because since morning she hadn't had time to eat anything proper. She had been standing for almost 18 hours straight, and now both her body and her spirit had been drained to the bottom. She leaned against the damp brick wall of the alley beside the diner, trying to catch her breath, but the world around her began to tilt. The streetlights blurred into warped circles of light, and the sound of the rain seemed to drift farther and farther away. She thought of the empty rented room waiting for her, of the debt she no longer knew how to pay now that she had lost her job, of the desolate loneliness of a person who had no one left in the world to call by name. And it was that thought, not hunger or cold, that drew the last drops of strength out of her. Her knees buckled, her back slid down along the wall, and Maggie collapsed onto the cold, wet alley floor, as if the invisible stack of plates she had been carrying for so many years had finally crushed her beneath its weight. In that dim and fading moment, she vaguely heard a door open behind her, heard steady, solid footsteps approaching through the rain, and then a tall shadow bent down beside her, blocking some of the water falling from above. Donovan Vale had stepped out of the diner right after witnessing the whole ugly performance, and now he was kneeling on one knee beside the woman who had treated him kindly a few hours before, the only person in this cold city who had looked at him as if he were human. He reached out and lifted her, and for the first time in many years, the voice he had only ever used to give orders rose with a tone almost gentle, asking if she could still hear him. Donovan lifted Maggie into his arms with a gentleness no one would have expected from a man like him, settled her against his shoulder to shield her from the rain, then turned and walked straight back into the diner. The door of Kane's Corner swung open once more, but this time the air inside froze instantly, like the surface of a lake touched by ice. The men who, only a few minutes earlier, had laughed at Maggie's humiliation, now stood rigid when they saw the woman they had just mocked being held in Donovan Vale's arms, and when they realized who he was, the blood seemed to drain from every face one by one. Donovan swept his eyes across the diner, his gaze slow and cold, stopping on each face that had thrown out those mocking words. Each one he had silently remembered from the beginning, and beneath that gaze, not a single person dared breathe too loudly. He spoke, his voice not loud at all, yet it carried through the deathly still room, saying he had just watched an entire diner full of people give themselves the right to trample a woman simply because she was gentle and couldn't strike back. He said he had met every kind of person in his life, and the kind he despised most was the one that only knew how to act strong in front of someone weaker, because that wasn't strength. It was cowardice wearing a mask. Only then did Bradford stumble forward, trying to force his voice into a flattering tone, saying this was only a matter inside the diner, that the girl was clumsy, and that was why he had to let her go. But Donovan only had to turn his head and look at him once, and Bradford went silent halfway through, the words dying instantly in his mouth under that piercing gaze. He told Bradford that he had just driven away the only decent person in that filthy diner, and that Bradford should remember his face well, because from this moment on, none of his business in Chicago would be as peaceful as it had been before. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't need a single blow. With only a few words, he made that fat diner owner tremble so hard he collapsed into the nearest chair, his face drained white, understanding just how large the disaster falling on his head had become. Donovan declared in front of the whole diner that from that night on, if any one of the people who had laughed just now dared touch Maggie Sullivan, even with a single word, they would answer directly to him. And the way he said it, calmly, as if he were discussing the weather, made it more terrifying than any scream could have been. Then he didn't bother to stay another second. He turned his back, carried Maggie out through the absolute silence of the diner, and left behind people who had just learned that sometimes the person they thought they could crush was the very one protected by a power they could never reach. He placed her on the back seat of the waiting black car, told the driver to take them to one of his safe houses in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city, and throughout the ride he kept her warm with his own coat, his eyes never leaving her pale face as her breathing slowly grew steadier again. When the car arrived, the one who opened the door to receive them was Rosa Delgado, the older woman who managed that house for Donovan, a woman with gray-streaked hair pinned neatly back and seasoned eyes that had seen through countless sorrows in life. The moment Rosa saw Maggie soaked through and exhausted in Donovan's arms, she understood everything without needing anyone to explain. With the voice of a mother, both firm and warm, she urged him to bring the girl inside, change her into dry clothes, cover her with warm blankets, and heat up a bowl of porridge. As the old woman dried Maggie's wet hair, she murmured gentle words of comfort, calling her child as if she had known her for years, and in that half-conscious, dreamlike haze between waking and sleep, Maggie felt the warmth of a caring hand she hadn't received in such a very long time. It was a warmth that made the first tear slip from the corner of her eye since she had collapsed, not because of humiliation anymore, but because, for the first time in many years, someone was treating her as if she deserved to be cherished. Maggie woke in an unfamiliar room, filled with the soft light of morning, lying on a bed more comfortable than anything she had ever rested her back on, and in the first moment, panic seized her because she didn't understand where she was, until the memory of last night slowly returned. Rosa was sitting on the edge of the bed, and when she saw Maggie open her eyes, she let out a breath of relief, placed a hand on her forehead to see whether the fever had passed, then told her to stay still and rest, because she had slept straight through from night until now. Maggie sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, her heart both grateful and embarrassed because she had troubled people who were strangers to her, and she softly asked where this place was and who had brought her here. Just then, Donovan stepped in, his tall frame filling the doorway, and when he saw that she was awake, he gave a slight nod and told Rosa to go downstairs and prepare something hot for her to eat. He pulled a chair closer, sat down at a proper distance, and told her in a calm voice that she didn't need to worry, that she was safe, and that the man who had fired and humiliated her last night would never be able to bother her again. He went on to say that he could arrange a place for her to stay, give her enough money so she wouldn't have to worry about food and shelter for the time ahead, and that he was more than capable of solving every trouble she was carrying. An offer like that, coming from a man with that much power, should have made anyone in her situation rejoice and nod at once, but Maggie was different. She was silent for a while, then lifted her eyes to look straight into his, and said she was grateful that he had saved her last night, grateful from the bottom of her heart, but she couldn't accept his pity. She said she had lived her whole life by her own two hands, had never held out her palm to ask anyone for a single dollar, and even if she had fallen all the way to the bottom, she still wanted to stand up by herself, because if she traded the last of her dignity for comfort, then she would have nothing left to call herself. Donovan frowned, slightly taken aback, because in his world, people fought to receive what he gave, and no one had ever refused him with such calm, proud composure. He said again that this wasn't pity, only help, but Maggie shook her head, smiled faintly, and replied that for a woman like her, a woman who had nothing left, the line between help and charity was very thin, and she would rather suffer while keeping her spirit intact than live comfortably with the feeling that she was a burden to someone else. She said she could work, that she wasn't afraid of any hard labor, and as long as she was given a chance, she would repay him little by little for everything he had spent. The way she said those words wasn't challenging or harsh, but calm and firm, like someone who understood her own worth too deeply, even if the whole world denied it. And that quiet toughness made Donovan look at her in an entirely different way, with a gaze mixed with curiosity, and a kind of respect he rarely gave anyone. He asked what had made a young woman carry so much, and still refused to collapse, and Maggie stayed silent for a long time, her eyes dimming for a moment as if looking far away. Then she only said softly that life had taken more from her than people could imagine, that there were losses she still hadn't learned how to make peace with even now, and she stopped there, saying nothing more about the thing hidden deep inside her heart. Donovan didn't press her, because he understood better than anyone what it felt like to carry a wound no one was allowed to touch. And in the shared silence between those two wounded souls, a fragile, invisible thread began to form, though neither of them yet knew it. That night, after leaving Maggie's room, Donovan sat alone in the dark study, with only the light from the desk lamp casting itself across his hardened face, and the girl's words about losses that had never faded kept echoing in his mind, stirring something he had buried deep for many years. Because he, too, had such a loss, a wound time had never healed, only covered with a layer of frost, and the person he could never forget, the person he could never forgive himself for failing to save, was Caroline, his own younger sister. Caroline was a few years younger than him, the only person in the world he had truly loved without condition. A young woman in her 20s who was so gentle and pure, she almost seemed as if she didn't belong to the dark world her older brother was walking into. She had once dreamed of simple things, had once smiled at the whole world with a smile Donovan had always believed could melt even the most hardened heart, and he had done everything he could to keep her away from the road he had chosen, so she could live an honest and peaceful life. But fate didn't let her go. Many years ago, When Donovan had not yet built the power he had now, Caroline fell into the hands of a ruthless gang, men who wanted to use her to put pressure on him, and during those dark days, she had endured the cruelty of the strong trampling over a girl who had no way to defend herself. What hurt Donovan down to the marrow wasn't only his sister's death, but the way this entire city had turned its face away when she needed help the most. The people who knew but stayed silent because they were afraid. The people who could have spoken up but chose to close their eyes because it wasn't their problem. She had been alone in the middle of a crowded city, abandoned by the very people who should have reached out their hands. And by the time Donovan heard the news and rushed to her, it was already too late. He could only hold what remained of the little sister he had sworn to protect with his own life. He never told anyone how he had lived through the days and months that followed, how he had collapsed, and then forced himself to rise again from the ashes of his own ruin as an entirely different man, colder, more ruthless, and carrying only one vow inside his heart. He swore that as long as he was alive, he would never again allow himself to stand among those who looked away from the suffering of the powerless, that wherever he saw a strong person stepping on someone who couldn't fight back, he would act, not out of any noble kindness, but as a way to atone for the greatest failure of his life, the failure that had come too late for his only sister. That was why all of Chicago came to know a Donovan Vale who was merciless toward the wicked, yet protected the poor and suffering with a fierceness people found difficult to understand. And that was why, on the rainy night before, when he saw Maggie being trampled by an entire diner full of people while no one defended her, something inside him had come alive with such force that he couldn't remain seated. Sitting in the darkness of the study, Donovan lifted a hand and rubbed lightly at the left side of his chest, where the old ache still smoldered whenever memories of Caroline came rushing back, and for the first time in a very long while, he realized that the image of the resilient woman who had refused his pity that afternoon had unknowingly touched the very emptiness his sister had left behind. He didn't know whether fate was trying to give him a chance to atone, or whether it was only reopening an old wound, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never let Maggie Sullivan face this world alone, the way his sister once had. In the days that followed, Maggie stayed at the house on the north side of the city, not as someone receiving charity, but under an agreement she had made with herself that she would help Rosa with the cooking and the running of the household in exchange for a temporary place to stay until she found a new job and was strong enough to take care of herself again. Donovan didn't object, perhaps because he understood that this was the only way she could preserve her dignity. And little by little, the first distances between two strangers were filled by simple, ordinary moments of daily life. In the mornings, she cooked with Rosa, and the warm smell of food spread through the house that had been cold for so long, making even Donovan begin coming home earlier than usual. There were evenings when he stayed on the back porch, and Maggie would make him a cup of tea, and the two of them would talk about things without beginning or end, about the weather, about food, about small matters neither of them had had anyone to share with for far too long. Gradually, the caution between them faded, and Donovan realized he could sit for hours just to hear her calm voice, while Maggie found in that cold man a sincere kind of listening she had never encountered in anyone before. One night, when the late autumn wind slipped across the porch and the conversation accidentally touched on family, Donovan softly asked why a kind woman like her had been left so alone in life. And this time, after so many days of keeping it hidden, Maggie decided not to avoid the truth anymore. She quietly told him that many years ago, she had once had a home, had once been married to a man she loved with all her heart, and had dreamed of a small family with children, the way so many other women dreamed. But then the years passed and she couldn't become pregnant. Again and again, hope flickered to life and then went out, and she sought treatment everywhere in vain, until she finally realized that her body would never give her the happiness of becoming a mother. She spoke with a calmness so painful it could break the heart, saying that her husband's family had at first only hinted at things, then slowly began to treat her openly like something broken, something that couldn't bear an heir. They looked at her with contempt every day, until even the husband she had once trusted turned his back on her, allowing his family to push her out the door the way people throw away something that no longer has any value. She said the pain of being cast aside for something beyond her control, something she had never chosen and couldn't change, had haunted her through all the years that followed, making her believe that perhaps she truly was a useless woman, just as people had always said. Her voice caught on the final words, but she didn't cry. She only tightened her rough hands around the cup of tea, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth, and added that from that day on, she no longer dared dream of happiness. She only tried to live from one day to the next and remain a decent person, even though life was rarely decent to her in return. Donovan sat in silence through the entire story, not interrupting once, not showing a trace of pity in his eyes. And when she finished, he didn't offer empty words of comfort. He only looked at her with the deep understanding of someone who had also been torn apart by pain. He said quietly that a person's worth had never depended on whether they could bear children, and that those who had abandoned her for that reason were the truly useless and blind ones, because they had failed to see the precious heart she carried inside her. His words were simple, but they touched the deepest place no one had reached in all those years. And for the first time in a very long while, Maggie felt as if someone had helped lift a small part of the burden from her chest. Maggie's chance to prove herself came on an evening when Donovan was forced to host a group of important figures in his business world, a crucial dinner through which he needed to strengthen his connections and affirm his position. Everything was supposed to have been entrusted to a well-known outside chef, but that very afternoon, everything fell into chaos when the chef suddenly reported that he couldn't come because of an unexpected emergency, leaving the entire kitchen cluttered with ingredients, and a dinner only a few hours away from beginning with no one to take command. Donovan's men rushed back and forth in a panic. Some called everywhere looking for a replacement, while others feared their boss's fury if the dinner collapsed, because they understood all too well how much an incident like that, in front of important guests, would damage Donovan's pride and reputation. In the middle of that noisy confusion filling the house, Maggie quietly stepped into the kitchen, looked over the scattered ingredients, then calmly rolled up her sleeves and told Rosa that she could handle it, that as long as everyone followed her arrangements, the dinner would still begin on time. At first, no one believed that a waitress who had just been fired could carry such an important dinner on her shoulders. A few men even muttered words of doubt, but Maggie didn't bother arguing. She simply began working with a calmness and clarity that stunned them all. It turned out that all those years of struggling through diner kitchens and carrying every kind of heavy labor had trained not only her skillful hands, but also an ability to organize and manage that she herself had almost forgotten she possessed. A talent buried beneath years of being looked down on, and never being given even one chance to shine. She assigned each person a task with clear precision, her hands moving swiftly as she prepared dish after dish, turning the chaotic pile of ingredients into beautifully arranged food fragrant enough to fill the air, everything flowing smoothly, as if she had done this 100 times before. When the powerful guests sat down at the table and tasted the dishes, the doubt on their faces quickly gave way to murmurs of praise, and the atmosphere of the dinner became warmer and livelier than Donovan had expected. He sat at the head of the table, silently observing it all, and in his eyes there was a new emotion as he looked toward the kitchen, where that woman had just saved his entire evening by herself, because now he no longer saw in her only a kind person who deserved protection, but someone truly capable and talented, someone worthy of respect. Even the men who had looked down on her at first now had to see her differently, quietly admiring the way she turned the situation around without the slightest sign of panic. But it was also from that dinner that whispers began spreading throughout Chicago, because among the guests there were more than a few who were curious about the strange woman in the crime boss's house, and before long, both the closed rooms of the upper class and the dark corners of the underworld were murmuring about how the cold Donovan Vale had suddenly brought home a poor waitress and placed her under his protection. People whispered in every possible way. Some mocked her body and her status, while others guessed at the schemes behind it all, and those cruel words gathered like a silent cloud moving closer, warning that the brief peace Maggie had just found would not last long, and that there were people beginning to watch her with intentions she could not yet foresee. During the days she lived in the house on the north side of the city, Maggie often went with Rosa to the small market nearby to buy groceries, and it was there that she noticed a little girl of about 5 or 6 named Lucy, the daughter of a young woman named Hannah who sold fruit from a street cart, a single mother struggling day by day to raise her child in hardship. Hannah had to watch both her stall and her daughter, and whenever there were many customers, she couldn't possibly keep her eyes on little Lucy, who played alone in a corner beside the stand. So Maggie, who had always carried an instinctive tenderness for children, naturally came closer and began talking to the child. At first Lucy was shy, but after only a short while, she clung to Maggie, because children always seem to have a strange sense for knowing who truly loves them, and Maggie had more than enough of that gentleness. She sat down beside the little girl, told her cheerful stories, taught her small games with a few pebbles and a piece of string, and Lucy's giggles rang out brightly through the market, softening even Hannah's tired face a little. Maggie noticed that Hannah and her daughter were living with great difficulty, and there were days when little Lucy had only a boiled sweet potato to keep hunger away. So from then on, each time she went to the market, Maggie quietly bought a little extra bread, a little milk, hid them in her basket, and slipped them to the girl, pretending they were only snacks rather than help, so Hannah wouldn't feel pitied and wounded. She even saved the small amount of money Rosa paid her for helping around the house to buy Lucy a new pair of shoes, when she saw that the child's old shoes were badly torn, and when the little girl threw her arms around Maggie and cried out in delight. Something in Maggie's chest felt strangely warm and painfully tender at the same time, because every time she held Lucy in her arms, every time she heard the child babble to her in that sweet, childish voice, Maggie felt clearly the emptiness life had carved deep into her heart, the calling of motherhood she had longed for until it burned, yet fate had never granted her. She had once thought she would never know what it felt like to care for a child, to watch a small life grow within her arms, and because she understood that loss so deeply, she cherished every moment with Lucy even more, pouring all the love that had been pressed down inside her for years into a little girl who wasn't bound to her by blood. Once, Rosa came upon the sight of Maggie braiding Lucy's hair on the porch, her face glowing with a gentle happiness the old woman had never seen before. And Rosa only stood there silently, her heart tightening with pity for the young woman who carried a heart overflowing with motherly love, yet had nowhere to give it fully. Donovan also witnessed her playing with Lucy a few times, and he realized that this woman possessed a boundless warmth that a cruel life had tried to bury but had never managed to extinguish. A heart that, the more it was wounded, the more it knew how to love others. He saw in her not a useless woman, as that blind world had judged her, but a born mother who had never been allowed to become one, and that realization made him admire her more deeply, while aching for her all the more. Those afternoons with Lucy in the poor market became a rare stretch of peace in Maggie's storm-battered life, a warm ray of sunlight slipping through dark clouds. But it was also in those days, when everything seemed to be gradually brightening, that a long-buried secret was quietly waiting for the day it would rise to the surface, a truth that, once exposed, would overturn everything Maggie had ever believed about her own misery. The truth began to come to light because of Donovan's own curiosity, because ever since the night he had dealt with Bradford at the diner, he had quietly sent his people to investigate every corner of the diner owner's business, the habit of a man who never left any threat behind him without tracing it all the way to the end. What his men dug up made even Donovan, a man who had witnessed every kind of filthy trick life could offer, frown, because behind the debt Maggie had been carrying day and night for more than a year was an entire scheme, carefully arranged and cruel to the bone. It turned out that Maggie's mother, before she passed away, had bought a life insurance policy with a payout that was not small at all, a sum of money she had saved throughout her whole life, and the named beneficiary was Maggie, her only daughter, in the hope that after she was gone, that money would help her child live a life with a little less hardship. But Maggie had never received even a single dollar of that money, and she didn't even know it existed, because Bradford Kane had acted first. That cunning diner owner had known Maggie's mother before, and when the older woman lay on her sickbed in the final days of her life, he took advantage of her weakness and trusting nature to trick her into signing papers she hadn't read carefully, then colluded with a professional document forger to turn himself into the person authorized to receive and manage that insurance payout. When Maggie's mother died, Bradford quietly swallowed the entire sum that should have belonged to her, then turned around and staged an even more brutal performance. He fabricated a huge hospital debt with false bills he claimed her mother had left behind, forcing Maggie to break her back working in his own diner to slowly repay a debt that had never existed. The poor girl believed the papers he showed her, believed she truly owed that money, and for more than a year she had worked herself to exhaustion, endured every kind of humiliation, only to repay the very man who had stolen her own mother's property, never knowing that she was both his victim and the one feeding the criminal who had ruined her. The most important clue lay in a yellowed envelope Donovan's men found hidden deep at the bottom of an old drawer in Bradford's warehouse. Inside were the original insurance policy and the documents proving the whole deception, things Bradford's own trembling hands had hidden away long ago because he hadn't dared destroy them in case he needed them someday, yet hadn't dared let them be exposed either. When Donovan placed that evidence on the table and slowly told Maggie the whole truth, she sat frozen, her calloused hands shaking violently, unable to believe what she had just heard. Her entire view of the world collapsed in that moment, because it turned out that all these years, she had been living inside a lie. She had blamed herself for being useless, had bowed her head and endured before the very man who was, in truth, robbing her upon her own pain, and the poverty and suffering that had tormented her until she collapsed in the rain that night had not been fate, but the deliberate crime of a human being. Her tears spilled over, not only because of outrage, but also because of sorrow for her late mother, who had placed the last of her love into that money only for it to fall into the hands of a wicked man. And in that shock, a new feeling began to rise inside the woman who had grown used to enduring everything in silence. It was the rightful anger of someone who had finally seen the face of the man who destroyed her life. Bradford Kane was not the kind of man who would sit still and wait for ruin. And when his eyes and ears in the city secretly reported that Donovan Vale was having people dig back through all of his shady business dealings, he understood at once that the scheme he had kept hidden for so long was standing on the edge of being exposed. A man like Bradford, when cornered, didn't choose repentance. He chose the most reckless path. And he realized that the key to all his trouble lay with Maggie herself, that as long as she was alive and still held the truth and that evidence in her hands, he would never have peace again. He decided to strike first, calculating that if he could control Maggie, he could use her as a bargaining chip against Donovan, or at the very least force her into silence. The opportunity came one afternoon, when Maggie left the house on the north side alone to run a few small errands in the city, the first time in many days that she had gone out without anyone accompanying her, because she was still used to standing on her own and didn't want to trouble Donovan's people all the time. Bradford's men had been waiting in advance. They blocked her at a quiet street corner, forced her into a car, and took her to an abandoned, forgotten warehouse on the bleakest edge of the city, the place he had used for years to store the things no one could be allowed to see. Maggie was held inside that cold warehouse, and facing her was Bradford, his usual sugary mask now completely fallen away, leaving only the viciousness of a man panicking because he was about to lose everything. He threatened her through clenched teeth, telling her she had to behave, had to deny everything and leave Chicago forever if she still wanted to remain unharmed. He tried to use his false authority and threats to break the will of the woman he had once thought was the easiest person in the world to bully. But the Maggie of this moment was no longer the waitress, who lowered her head and endured everything in silence. Now, she knew the truth. She knew he was the man who had stolen her mother's property and pushed her into years of suffering. And instead of trembling in fear, she lifted her head, looked straight into his face, and said in a voice that shook but was full of resolve that she would never be silent again, that she had endured enough, and that she wouldn't let him trample her one more time. That unexpected strength made Bradford even more furious, and he raged and shouted, but right in the middle of that moment, when the tension was stretched like a rope about to snap, the roar of engines sounded outside the warehouse, followed by the crash of a door being forced open. Donovan had arrived. It turned out that as soon as Maggie's disappearance was discovered, his men had followed every trace with the speed of men who knew exactly what they were doing, and Donovan himself, with the instinct of a man who had once lost the most precious thing in his life because he had come too late, had rushed there personally without wasting a single second. He appeared in the warehouse doorway, his tall figure outlined against the light spilling in from outside, and the look in his eyes as he took in the scene before him was so cold it made Bradford's men shrink back. This time he hadn't come too late, and the painful memory from years ago of failing to save the one he loved seemed to dissolve in the instant he saw Maggie still safe. Their eyes met across that strained space, and in the look she gave him there was not the weakness of someone begging to be rescued, but a steady faith that he had come, and that now she was no longer alone in standing against evil. Donovan stepped inside, his heavy, deliberate steps cutting through the tense silence of the warehouse, and the restrained fury inside him was now ready to fall upon the man who had dared touch the person he was determined to protect, at any cost. Bradford's men had just started to rush forward to stop him when Donovan's men poured in behind him, and within moments, the whole group was subdued cleanly, forced to lower their hands and back into a corner beneath the overwhelming force of men, far more seasoned than they were. Donovan didn't bother glancing at the henchman who had been neutralized. His eyes stayed fixed on Bradford, who was now retreating step by step, his face drained white, the aggressive mask he had worn only moments earlier gone without a trace. He went to Maggie first, took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, then quietly asked whether she had been hurt anywhere, his voice softening in a way that was entirely different. Only when he saw her nod to say she was all right did he turn toward the diner owner, and in that instant, all that tenderness vanished, giving way to a cold fury more frightening than any scream. Donovan advanced on Bradford one step at a time, and with every footfall, the man backed away another step until his back struck the cold wall, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Donovan told him in a low, sharp voice that in this city there was one kind of person he hated more than all others, the cowardly kind that robbed and crushed people with no voice and no power to defend themselves, the kind that used another person's weakness and trust to profit for himself. He said Bradford was exactly that kind of man, the one who had tricked a dying woman into signing a cruel piece of paper, the one who had stolen the last money a mother had set aside for her daughter, then built an entire chain of false debt to torment that girl for years. In the moment he looked into Bradford's vile face, now shriveled with fear, an old memory of his lost sister flared inside Donovan, because this man wasn't the same person who had caused Caroline's tragedy all those years ago, but he belonged to the same breed, carried the same cruel nature of the strong crushing the weak, the very kind of man Donovan had sworn all his life never to spare. That resemblance made his anger no longer merely the punishment of a crime. It carried with it the personal pain he had held inside for so many years, and Bradford, though he couldn't fully understand what was happening inside the man before him, still sensed that his fate had already been decided. But Donovan didn't lay a hand on him, because for someone like Bradford, fists would be too light and too quick. He chose a punishment that would cost the man far more. He told Bradford that all the evidence of his deception was already in Donovan's hands, that he would turn everything over to the authorities, so Bradford would have to face the law for fraud and document forgery, and that at the same time, Donovan would use every bit of his influence to make sure Bradford would never rise again in this city. Every business connection he had would collapse, and every door would slam shut in his face. He said Bradford would lose everything he had stolen, that all of Chicago would know him as a man who preyed on the desperate, and that he would have to live the rest of his life under the contempt and rejection of the very society he had once thought he could fool. Bradford collapsed onto the warehouse floor, his mouth stammering pleas for forgiveness, but Donovan only turned away coldly, ordering his men to escort him out and hand him over properly to the authorities along with every piece of evidence. Then he walked back to Maggie, gently supported her out of that dark warehouse, and brought her back toward the light, closing forever the dark chapter that greedy man had forced upon her life. When the matter was brought into the light, Maggie stood before a choice she knew would determine the rest of her life. Because in order to force Bradford to answer for his crimes before the law, someone had to step forward as a witness, openly recount everything he had done, and that meant she would have to expose before everyone all the pain, humiliation, and bitter years she had once tried to bury. Donovan told her that he could handle everything himself in his own way, without requiring her to appear, that he didn't want her to face any more wounds. But Maggie shook her head. The woman who had once lowered her head and endured, who had once let insults slide over her without daring to answer back, was different now, because the seed of courage she had always hidden in her heart had grown stronger through the days that had just passed. From the moment she dared lift her head and refuse pity, to the night she carried an entire dinner on her own shoulders to prove her worth, and then to the moment she dared look straight into the face of the man who had harmed her and say she would no longer be silent. She told Donovan in a resolute voice that this was her life, her honor and her mother's honor, so she had to be the one to stand up and demand justice for herself, rather than forever hiding behind someone else to be protected. She said that if she stayed silent out of fear, she would always remain the weak person people had thought she was for so many years, and she was too tired of being a victim. It was time for her to rewrite her own fate. And so Maggie did something the version of herself from a few months earlier would never have dared to dream of. She personally reported the entire matter to the authorities, calmly and clearly recounting every detail, providing all the evidence contained in the yellowed envelope, along with her honest testimony, without avoiding anything or trembling under the scrutinizing eyes around her. Before the investigators, she was no longer the waitress people had looked down on, but a dignified woman standing up to reclaim what was right, and it was precisely that courage, together with the undeniable evidence, that made the scales of justice tip fully in her favor. Bradford Kane had to face a series of charges for fraud, document forgery, and the unlawful seizure of property, and with both Donovan's hidden influence and the weight of Maggie's testimony pressing down on him, he had no path left to deny his crimes. The dishonest business empire he had built over so many years collapsed completely, and from then on, the name Bradford Kane was spoken throughout Chicago as that of a man who had exploited the desperate and deserved to be despised. The insurance money Maggie's mother had left behind, after being withheld for so many years, was finally returned to the rightful heir, and along with it came compensation for everything that had been taken from her, so that for the first time in her life, Maggie held something that belonged to her completely, openly, and lawfully. But what she regained was greater than money. It was dignity and truth. It was the proof she gave to the whole world, and more importantly to herself, that she had never been useless or contemptible the way people had judged her to be. When she stepped out through the doors of the public office with the papers confirming her rights in her hand, Maggie held her head high beneath the sunlight, and Donovan was waiting for her there, looking at her with eyes full of pride, because he understood that this woman had reclaimed her life by herself. And that was what made her stronger and more beautiful than ever before. Now that every injustice had been cleared away, and Maggie finally held what rightfully belonged to her, she stood at a new turning point in her life, because there was no longer any reason for her to keep staying in Donovan's house. She was strong enough to take care of herself, had enough money to begin again, and the dignity that had always lived inside her made her think it was time for her to leave so she wouldn't become a burden to anyone. One evening, she went to find Donovan on the familiar back porch, intending to thank him and say goodbye. But just as the words began to rise to her lips, he interrupted her. Donovan stood up, and for the first time since she had known him, the man who was always calm and in command of every situation seemed to hesitate, as if what he was about to say was harder than all the life and death decisions he had ever faced. He told her that he knew she was planning to leave, and he also knew that now she had every right to do so, that she could walk out through this door and live a new life without depending on anyone. Then he looked straight into her eyes and said that he wasn't asking her to stay because she had nowhere else to go, because now the whole wide world lay open before her, but because he wanted her to stay for an entirely different reason. He said that through all his years of living in a cold world where everyone either feared him or tried to use him, he had grown used to the idea that his heart was frozen and believed it would remain that way forever, until that rainy night when a strange woman brought him a bowl of hot soup and treated him like a human being instead of a frightening name. He said it was she, with her kindness that asked for nothing, with her unbroken strength, and with the warm heart that this cruel world had never managed to extinguish, who had done what no one had been able to do in all those years, which was make the ice inside his chest begin to melt. He admitted that he had chosen her, not out of pity as she had once feared, not because she was weak and needed protection, but because she was the most honest and beautiful thing that had ever stepped into his shadowed life. He said he had chosen her from the moment he carried her out of the rain, had chosen her through every day he watched her rise above hardship with a dignity few people possessed, and now he was asking to choose her every day for the rest of his life, but only if she wanted that too, because he never wanted her to stay because she owed him, or because she had no other choice. Maggie stood motionless, listening to every word he spoke, and this time the tears sliding down her face were not tears of humiliation or pain like so many times before in her life, but the tears of a heart she had thought had grown numb now being brought back to life, the tears of a happiness she had no longer dared believe she deserved. She smiled faintly through her tears, and she answered him not with the gratitude of someone repaying a debt, but with the free choice of a woman who had found her own worth again. She said she was staying not because she needed him to save her, because she had already learned to stand firmly on her own 2 feet, but because she had chosen him too, had chosen the man who had seen who she truly was, when the rest of the world saw only a laughable shadow. She said she had nothing left to prove to anyone, and because of that, she could give him her heart completely and peacefully, as 2 equal people choosing each other, not as the strong granting mercy to the weak. And beneath the Chicago night sky, 2 people who had once been wounded to the very depths of themselves finally found in each other the home they had both been searching for all their lives. A few days after the night the 2 of them laid their hearts bare, Donovan brought Maggie into his private study, a room he had rarely allowed anyone to enter all this time, and from a locked drawer beneath the bottom of the desk, he took out a small, old wooden box and placed it on the table before her, with a tenderness she had never seen in this hard man. He opened the lid, and inside was a silver pocket watch dulled by time, with a small line of words engraved on the back that had nearly faded, an object that seemed ordinary at first glance, yet one he had preserved like the most precious treasure of his life. Donovan said quietly that this was Caroline's keepsake, the younger sister he had told her about, the watch she had always carried with her and treated like a charm. the only thing of hers he had been able to keep after that fateful day. He said that through all these years, he had never let anyone touch it. He had never thought there would come a day when he would want to give it to someone else. Because to him, that watch was everything left of the love he had failed to protect in time. Then he looked at Maggie with a gaze deep beyond words, and said he wanted to give it to her, not so she could replace Caroline's place in his heart, because no one could ever replace his sister, but because he saw in her the same light his sister once had, a kind heart no darkness in the world could ever bury. He said giving this watch to her was his way of letting the dead rest in peace while also honoring the living, his way of telling her that she deserved to be cherished and protected, in the way he had been unable to do for his sister all those years ago. Maggie received the watch with trembling hands. She understood completely the sacred meaning of this gift and the trust he was placing in her, and she pressed it to her chest, promising him that she would keep it safe as carefully as he had kept it all this time, and that she would treasure Caroline's memory as part of the story that now belonged to them both. That moment held no grand vows, only two people sharing the deepest hidden wounds inside them, and deciding to keep walking forward together. But it was more sacred than any ceremony in the world. And then, as time passed, when Maggie officially stepped into Donovan's life as the woman beside him, all of Chicago began to look at her with entirely different eyes. Those who had once whispered and mocked the poor waitress now had to fall silent, because the story of the woman who had courageously stood up to expose an evil man, who had reclaimed justice for herself through her own dignity and strength, had spread across the city and made more than a few people feel ashamed of their shallow judgments. People no longer saw only her full figure or humble status as something to laugh at, but began to see a strong, kind, and respectable human being, a woman even the most powerful man in Chicago cherished and admired. The contemptuous looks from the past slowly gave way to respect, and for the first time in her life, Maggie walked through this city without lowering her head, without shrinking herself smaller, because now she stood upright with all the worth she had always deserved to have recognized, though it had taken the world far too long to open its eyes and finally see it. That winter passed in a peace Maggie had never dared dream of, and when the last snowflakes melted away to make room for spring, her life had turned to an entirely new page. She and Donovan did not rush. They allowed their feelings to grow naturally through each day spent beside each other, through warm meals shared with Rosa, through the afternoons when Maggie still visited little Lucy and her mother at the small market, through the way Donovan slowly learned to smile more often, and the way Maggie slowly learned to believe that she truly deserved happiness. With the money she had rightfully recovered, and with the cooking talent she had proven on the night she saved that dinner long ago, Maggie decided to open a small, cozy diner of her own, not as a way to depend on Donovan, but as a life's work that belonged to her alone, a place where she treated every guest with the same kindness she had always carried in her heart. Before long, her little diner became a favorite place for many people, not only because the food was good, but also because of the warmth that seemed to radiate from the gentle, smiling woman who owned it. She had found her own worth again, not because anyone had handed it to her, but through her own two hands and her own strength, and that made her prouder than anything else. Then, on an early summer morning, when golden sunlight fell softly through the window of the house that had truly become a home, Maggie received a miracle she had spent her whole life believing fate had denied her forever. She discovered that she was carrying a tiny life inside her, a living seed she had cried herself empty for through all those years, because she believed she would never have it. The woman the world had once insulted as a big-bodied woman who couldn't bear even one child. The woman who had been cast aside by her husband's family and trampled by life for something she couldn't change, was now going to become a mother. She held the result in trembling hands, tears streaming down her face, and she went to Donovan in one of the most private and sacred moments of their lives, with no one else there to witness it but the two of them. When she softly told him that they were going to have a child, the ruthless, cold man all of Chicago feared went silent for a moment. Then his eyes reddened too, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly yet tenderly, as if he were cradling his whole world. In each other's arms, those two people who had once been wounded to the very depths of themselves cried together. But these were tears of overflowing happiness, tears of a miracle that had come to people who had passed through too many storms and still kept their hearts kind. And so the story of Maggie Sullivan and Donovan Vale closed not with tragedy, but with a new beginning filled with light, proof that the most beautiful things sometimes come to us when we least expect them, at the very end of the darkest nights, because this life, no matter how much it takes from us, always keeps certain miracles for hearts that know how to love and never lose themselves. Their story leaves us with a profound lesson, that a person's worth has never been measured by outward appearance or by whether they can bear children, nor does it lie in wealth, poverty, or the status the world assigns to them. The true value of every person lies in the heart they carry, in the kindness they give, and in the way they treat other human beings, especially when those people are at their most desperate and most vulnerable. Maggie was loved and cherished not because she changed herself to please the world, but because at last, someone had enough wisdom to see the beauty that had always existed within her, and that is also a gentle reminder that each of us deserves to be seen for who we truly are. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please leave a like and share it with more people, so that together we can spread warm and humane messages about compassion in life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to many more moving and meaningful stories waiting for you ahead. We would truly love to know how you feel about today's story, so please leave a comment sharing the thoughts and emotions from deep within your heart, because every word you share is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very final moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health and a life filled each day with joy, peace, and love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.